Nick Mariani stood outside Mariani's Pizzeria, staring at the neon sign flickering in the late afternoon light. His pizzeria, the very place that had once been nothing more than a modest dream, now stood as a thriving local institution. With two locations expanding into a third, Nick had spent the past several years managing spreadsheets, reviewing financial reports, and building his business empire. But somehow, he had lost the connection he once had with the heart of it all. He'd built his restaurant on the promise of quality food, community, and, above all, treating his employees like family. But as the business grew, Nick noticed a shift. Employee turnover was higher than ever. Customers had started to grumble about service delays, and, worst of all, he could sense a rift growing between himself and his team. Something had changed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was now more of a businessman than a restaurateur. He was overseeing numbers, not people. That gnawing feeling drove him to make a decision. He would go undercover. Not as the polished CEO, but as just another regular guy looking for a good meal. He'd been to the pizzeria hundreds of times, but never with the intent of observing the inner workings. Never with the intent to listen, to feel, to understand. This time, he was going in as a customer. Nick pulled his baseball cap down low, hiding the face everyone at the pizzeria knew well. He swapped his usual crisp shirts and tailored jackets for an old hoodie and faded jeans. The transformation was enough to make him feel anonymous, a stranger among the familiar faces. For the first time in years, he could blend into the crowd and see what it was really like for his staff. The door chimed softly as he entered, the familiar scent of fresh dough and garlic filling the air. The place was bustling, as usual. A few regulars waved at the staff while the sounds of sizzling pans and clattering dishes echoed from the open kitchen. The din of voices filled the air, but Nick noticed something wasn't right. The energy felt different. There was a tension, something unspoken in the way the servers rushed between tables, the way the cooks darted around the kitchen in what seemed like a race against time. He slipped into a booth near the back. The din of the restaurant continued, but he paid no mind. Instead, he leaned back, watching, observing. He'd seen this place at its peak, with servers smiling and customers laughing. But now, the smiles seemed a little forced. The laughter, a little hollow. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself that it was all part of running a growing business. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't help but feel that something was off. A waitress, young with a tired smile, approached his table. Her name tag read Megan. She didn't seem to notice the customer sitting before her was her boss. Too caught up in the pace of her shift, too overwhelmed by the responsibilities she was juggling. "Hi, can I start you off with something to drink?" she asked, her voice warm but strained, as though she was trying to mask something. "Water's fine," Nick replied, keeping his voice low, casual. He wasn't here for the food, at least not yet. He was here to listen, to understand. As Megan turned to go, Nick's eyes landed on one of his delivery drivers, Greg, who had just come in from the back. Greg was a middle-aged man, reliable and always willing to stay late, but there was something different about him today. His usual confident posture had collapsed slightly, his eyes heavy with worry. Nick watched him for a moment, but before he could catch Greg's attention, the driver disappeared into the kitchen. The first few minutes passed uneventfully. Megan returned with his water and took his order, scribbling it down quickly. He asked for the house special, a pizza he knew well, but one he hadn't tasted in months. When she left, he returned his focus to the room. That's when he noticed Henry, the elderly dishwasher who had worked at the pizzeria longer than anyone else. Henry moved with an almost painful slowness, his hunched shoulders a stark contrast to the youthful energy of the rest of the staff. Even in his advanced age, Henry had never shown signs of slowing down. But today, his movements were deliberate, each one calculated. He was doing his best, but it was clear he was worn out. Nick's heart clenched a little as he watched Henry's weathered hands work with precision, stacking plates despite the arthritis that surely plagued him. This was the kind of worker Nick had always been proud of, loyal, hardworking, and humble. But lately, something had changed. He couldn't help but notice that Henry's once cheery demeanor had been replaced by a quiet sadness that Nick couldn't quite place. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed heavier now. Nick leaned back and tried to relax, but his thoughts were swirling. He watched as a mother with two small children approached the register, fumbling nervously with her wallet. Megan behind the counter noticed immediately. Nick could hear her muttering something under her breath, rolling her eyes as she rang up the meal. He saw the mother's shoulders slump as she reached into her purse and came up short. The look on her face, panic, embarrassment, sent a jolt through Nick. But before the scene could escalate, Henry, from his position at the dish station, spotted the exchange. He walked over, his old legs moving with a quiet determination. Without saying a word, he discreetly slipped money into Megan's hand, covering the difference for the woman. Nick was stunned. Megan, looking around to see if anyone had noticed, smirked and walked away, clearly unfazed. But the young mother's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She gathered her children and left, her voice trembling as she thanked Henry quietly for his kindness. Nick's mind was reeling. He had never seen this side of Henry before, but it was clear that this was a regular occurrence. Henry had been helping customers like this, covering bills, giving what little he had left, all while working tirelessly in the back of the kitchen. Yet here was Megan, casually mocking him, exploiting his kindness. The pieces started to fall into place. Nick's hands tightened around his coffee cup. His heart sank. This wasn't just about a financial struggle. It was about something much deeper. His employees weren't just struggling with work. They were fighting battles outside the restaurant, and Nick hadn't been paying attention. Today, that was going to change. The clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation filled the pizzeria as Nick continued to watch the room through his nearly hidden vantage point. He had a sinking feeling that his observations so far were just the surface. There was more to this story, and it involved more than just his employees. It involved the way his business was evolving, or rather, devolving. He had spent so many years focusing on expansion and growth, but now, with every passing minute in his booth, he was beginning to realize that something far more critical had been slipping through the cracks. The well-being of the people who helped make his pizzeria a success. As the hours passed, Nick observed Megan and Troy, who had started their shifts with the same enthusiasm as always. But to Nick, their actions now seemed different, more calculated, less genuine. He noticed how their interactions with customers had a thin layer of politeness, almost as though it was a mask they wore when the boss wasn't around. But when they thought no one was looking, their true selves began to show. Troy was the first to approach the counter, his shoulders slumped from the weight of the day's grind. He glanced over at Nick and made eye contact for a second before turning his attention to Megan. They exchanged a few brief words that Nick couldn't quite make out, but their body language spoke volumes. There was something happening here, something that didn't sit right with him. "Table 4 is getting a bit too much attention," Megan said as she wiped her hands on her apron. Her voice was low, but Nick caught it. "We've got regulars asking for extra toppings again. Think we should charge for it, or just let it slide like last time?" Troy rolled his eyes, clearly not enjoying the conversation. "Just let it slide. Why bother? But don't expect to see any tips if we keep doing that." His words were sharp, dismissive. Nick's stomach churned as he watched Troy glance over at Henry, who was still diligently working in the dish station, oblivious to the subtle jab thrown his way. Megan, too, seemed to struggle with the same emotions Nick had seen in his employees before. There was a kind of restlessness to her, a dissatisfaction that didn't come from the customers but from something deeper. She looked over at Henry, wiping down the counter with the same worn-out cloth she had used before. She didn't say anything, but Nick saw it in her eyes. A look of resignation. A look that said she had been part of something bigger than herself, but had long since lost sight of the reason she stayed. Nick's phone buzzed in his pocket. He was tempted to ignore it, but he felt the urgency from his assistant, Janet. He quickly checked the message and saw a note about some key financial reports coming through. The numbers weren't adding up. His thoughts began to spiral as he put his phone away, trying to refocus. As he glanced around, he noticed that Henry had left the kitchen again, moving slowly but deliberately towards another table. The elderly dishwasher was speaking with a young couple in booth 5, clearly sharing a moment of genuine connection. The couple, dressed in business attire, smiled gratefully at Henry, who offered a few words of encouragement to the woman. who had clearly been worried about something. Henry patted her hand, his gesture warm and compassionate, as if he had known her for years. Nick leaned in, his curiosity piqued. He hadn't seen Henry interact like this before, but his instincts were telling him that there was more going on than just a friendly gesture. As he observed from his seat, he overheard part of the conversation, enough to understand the depth of the struggle Henry had been dealing with. "We've all been through tough times," Henry said softly, his voice low and steady. "You have to keep going, even when things look grim. Trust me, I know what it's like to feel like everything's slipping away." Nick's heart tightened in his chest as he listened to the words. His thoughts shifted back to his earlier observation. The way Henry had been covering for customers, the way he'd helped that woman with her bill earlier. Henry wasn't just a dishwasher. He was the lifeblood of this pizzeria, the glue holding it all together in a way no one else could. But why? Why hadn't Nick known any of this before? Why hadn't he seen the cracks in the foundation, the tired eyes of his employees, the worn-out faces hidden behind the smiles they had to put on for their customers? Before he could answer that question, something even more unexpected happened. As Nick watched Henry return to his station, he noticed Troy and Megan exchanging more whispered words, this time with less subtlety than before. Their voices were rising, filled with frustration and bitterness. "He's got it all figured out," Megan muttered, clearly irritated. "Saves everyone, takes pity on the regulars, but we're the ones doing all the work." Troy snorted. "Yeah, well, maybe if he wasn't so busy playing hero, he'd notice how bad things are getting around here." Nick felt the sting of their words. He could hear the resentment in their voices. But what really caught his attention was the way they were turning Henry into a scapegoat, someone to blame for the problems they couldn't or wouldn't fix themselves. The way they were scheming, preparing to shift the blame to the one person who had given everything to the pizzeria. That was it. Nick's mind was made up. He would uncover the truth, not just for his business, but for Henry. For the man who had spent years building relationships with customers, who had quietly supported those around him when no one else would. And now, Nick had to do something about it. The following day, Nick returned to Carter's Pizzeria. He parked his car several blocks away, allowing himself the time to walk up to the pizzeria like any other customer. The morning sun was bright, casting long shadows on the sidewalk, but Nick felt none of the usual optimism that came with the early hours of a new day. His mind was racing as he entered through the familiar wooden doors, the same ones he had walked through countless times as a young man before the success of the business had taken over every aspect of his life. He immediately noticed the subtle differences. The way the staff walked around with purpose but lacked the usual enthusiasm. Megan was manning the register, her eyes glued to the screen, and Troy was already busying himself in the kitchen, not saying much. Henry was nowhere in sight, and for a moment, Nick felt an uneasy stillness take hold of him. He had come to recognize that silence in the pizzeria before, but today it felt different. It felt like something was wrong, a weight that had been growing, but no one had yet acknowledged. He ordered a pizza, sitting near the counter with a clear view of the whole room. As he waited, he noticed how Patricia, the manager, seemed tense, her gaze flicking over her employees every so often, as if she were waiting for something to fall apart. Nick couldn't help but wonder if she, too, was beginning to see the subtle cracks forming in the foundation of the restaurant. As the lunch rush picked up, the pizzeria came alive with the usual bustle, clattering plates, orders being shouted, and the occasional joke from the kitchen. But Nick could still feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. It was as though everyone was going through the motions but not truly connected. Something had been lost. That was when he saw Henry again. The elderly man shuffled in from the back, his apron stained and his hands weathered but steady. He moved slower than usual, his once quick steps now tempered by age, but his eyes still held that warmth. Nick watched him approach the counter, where a young woman was fumbling with her wallet. She seemed embarrassed, counting the change with a shaky hand. Henry immediately stepped forward, a comforting presence, offering to pay the difference without hesitation. The woman's face softened with relief, and she thanked him profusely. Nick could hear the gratitude in her voice. Henry didn't seem bothered by the interruption. He simply nodded and smiled, doing what he did best, making people feel at ease. But that's when Nick overheard it. a conversation he hadn't been expecting. "Are you sure you're okay?" the woman asked Henry, concern lacing her voice. Henry smiled gently, but his eyes betrayed the weight of his struggles. "I've been better," he said quietly, brushing it off as if it were nothing. "But as long as I can help, I'm good." Nick could tell there was more to the story, but he didn't push it. Instead, he focused on the scene unfolding before him. Troy and Megan had just exchanged another set of whispered words, but this time, Nick didn't have to strain to hear them. Their voices were sharper, colder than before. "I can't believe he does this all the time," Megan murmured. "Like he's got nothing better to do than babysit everyone else." "Doesn't even care how he's getting screwed over," Troy shot back, his voice low and condescending. "Maybe it's time someone finally did something about it." Nick's stomach churned as he listened. It was all starting to fall into place now. Their words, the way they had been treating Henry, it wasn't just a casual thing. It was a scheme. They were planning to take advantage of Henry's kindness, to paint him as the one at fault. And they had no idea Nick was sitting there, hearing it all. Patricia, who had been quietly observing the scene from behind the counter, seemed to sense something was off. She walked over to Henry, trying to speak to him. But Nick couldn't hear the conversation from his spot. He could, however, see Henry's face fall, his shoulders slumping under the weight of whatever was being said. The old man hadn't deserved any of this. He had worked tirelessly, silently holding up the pizzeria while others seemed to have forgotten the value of hard work and kindness. As the day continued, Nick kept his eye on the dynamic. It wasn't just Henry being mistreated anymore, it was the way the entire team seemed to be fragmented. Megan and Troy's scheming, Patricia's lack of involvement, the subtle dismissals of customers, all of it added up to a culture that was shifting in the wrong direction. Nick had already made up his mind. It was time to act, not just for the sake of the business, but for Henry, the man who had quietly given everything to Carter's Pizzeria without ever asking for anything in return. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow, he would show them all what true leadership and compassion looked like. No more hiding behind the disguise of an ordinary customer. He would confront the situation head-on, and he would make sure that the values he once built his business on, respect, integrity, and family, would be restored, no matter the cost. The following morning, Nick arrived at Carter's Pizzeria long before the first customers would trickle in. He parked his car several blocks away, just as he had during his previous visits. This time, however, he wasn't just here to observe. He had spent the night formulating a plan, one that would address the tension, the deceit, and the neglect he had witnessed over the past few days. As he stepped inside, the familiar scent of baking pizza dough filled his lungs, but it did little to comfort him today. The usual hum of activity was absent. The floors, usually polished and gleaming, felt lifeless. Even the sounds of sizzling in the kitchen seemed muted, as if the heart of the pizzeria had been turned down low. He walked to the back and entered through the staff entrance, where he could see the entire crew prepping for the day. Megan was leaning against the counter, texting on her phone. Troy, as expected, was checking inventory, his back to Nick as he made his way into the kitchen. Patricia was already inside, walking around the kitchen with a clipboard, her face tight as she flipped through order sheets. But there was no sign of Henry yet. Nick made his way to the corner of the room, sitting at the same booth he had used during his undercover visits. He could see everything from here, every quiet exchange, every subtle glance. He wasn't here to blend in today. He was here to take control. Within minutes, Henry walked in. He didn't look much different than he had before, but today there was a weary weight to his movements. His eyes, normally full of kindness, seemed clouded by something deeper, something no one could see. He hung up his jacket, wiping his brow as he approached the kitchen. "Henry, over here," Nick called out from the booth, his voice steady yet carrying the authority that only an owner could command. Henry froze for a moment, his face a mixture of confusion and surprise. "Mr. Carter?" he asked hesitantly, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't expected to see Nick in the back, not like this. Nick could see his hands tremble as he adjusted his apron, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Come here," Nick said, patting the seat next to him. "I want to have a word." Nick's tone was calm but insistent, and despite Henry's discomfort, he slowly made his way to the booth. As Henry sat down, Nick noticed the way he tried to straighten himself, though it was clear his back wasn't doing him any favors. Nick had always respected Henry. He had known him for years, watching him as he worked tirelessly without ever seeking recognition. But today, as he sat across from him, there was a sense of urgency. He had to make this right, for Henry and for the business. "I've been watching," Nick began, his voice quiet but resolute. "Watching you. Watching the way you've been treated. And I can see what's been going on here." Henry didn't respond, but his eyes lowered, as if he knew exactly where this conversation was headed. "I know what they're doing," Nick said, his voice now tinged with anger, but also a deep sorrow. "I know how they've been treating you behind your back, and I know they've been planning to throw you under the bus." Henry flinched slightly, his tired eyes now filled with a mix of disbelief and hurt. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Instead, he simply nodded, his face a reflection of years of silent suffering. Nick leaned forward, locking eyes with Henry. "It's not just you, Henry. This pizzeria was built on the idea that we treat our employees like family. And somehow I've lost sight of that. I've been so focused on growth, on expansion, on everything else, and I've neglected the very people who helped me build this place. But I'm done with that." Nick paused, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. "No more. Not after what I've seen." Henry finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I don't want trouble, Mr. Carter. I never did. I've done what I can for the team. For the people." His words trailed off, as if he didn't know how to express everything that had been weighing on him for so long. "I know," Nick replied, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's time you got what you deserve. You don't deserve this. You deserve better." There was a long pause between them as Nick studied Henry's face. He could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the years of hard work that had gone unnoticed. But he could also see the integrity and the quiet dignity in the man. Henry had never asked for help, never complained. But it was time to change that. Nick stood up from the booth, his hands clenched at his sides, and looked around the kitchen. "Patricia," he called, his voice carrying across the space. She looked up from the counter, startled by his sudden command. "Get everyone together, all the staff now." She nodded, hesitating for a moment before heading off to gather the crew. Nick stood by the booth, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. Today, he would make things right. Within minutes, the entire team had assembled in front of him, with Henry standing quietly near the back. They were all there, Patricia, Megan, Troy, and even the line cooks, their faces filled with curiosity. Everyone seemed to know that something big was coming, but no one had an idea of what exactly. Nick turned toward the group, his gaze sweeping over each face. "There's been a lot of dishonesty here," he began, his voice strong and unwavering. "I've been watching, and what I've seen isn't just disrespect, it's betrayal, and I won't stand for it." He gestured toward Henry, who stood silently, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "This man," Nick said, his voice growing louder, "Henry Lawson, has been here for 7 years. He's worked harder than any of you. And yet, some of you, you've taken advantage of his kindness. You've used him as a scapegoat. And today, I'm putting an end to that." Troy and Megan exchanged nervous glances, their faces draining of color. They had been caught, and there was no turning back now. Nick stepped forward, his anger barely contained. "Troy, Megan, step forward." They hesitated, but when Nick's gaze didn't falter, they reluctantly moved forward. "You two have been stealing from the register, and worse, you've been framing Henry for your own mistakes, scheming behind his back. You've made his life harder than it needed to be." The room fell silent. Megan's eyes welled up with tears, and Troy's face twisted with defiance. I, I didn't mean," Megan began, but Nick cut her off. "No excuses," Nick said, his voice sharp. "You're both done here. I'm firing you, effective immediately. You've shown your true colors and they don't belong here." As they were escorted out, the silence in the pizzeria was palpable. But Nick knew this wasn't enough. This wasn't just about firing a couple of employees. This was about rebuilding the trust and integrity that had once been the heart of Carter's Pizzeria. He turned to Henry, who had not moved an inch, still standing quietly in the corner. Nick approached him slowly, his heart heavy with the realization of what he had failed to see before. "Henry," Nick said softly, "I owe you an apology. You've worked tirelessly for this business, and I've never truly acknowledged the sacrifice you've made. But today, that changes. Today, you're no longer just a dishwasher. You're a valued member of this team, and you'll be treated as such." Henry's eyes widened, and for a moment, Nick could see the weight of years of hardship finally lifting. "You're getting a promotion," Nick continued, his voice steady. "From now on, you're going to be my right hand. I'm promoting you to manager. I'll make sure you get the pay, the hours, and the respect you deserve. And I'll take care of your medical bills. It's time I finally stepped up and did right by you." Henry's face crumpled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to let the tears fall. "Thank you," he whispered. Nick smiled warmly, feeling the weight of a promise fulfilled. "No, thank you, Henry." The rest of the staff stood quietly, watching the exchange with a mixture of awe and guilt. The atmosphere in the room was different now, lighter, hopeful, as if the air itself had shifted. As the crew returned to their stations, Nick stood in the middle of the room, the pizzeria now pulsing with renewed energy. He had made the hard choices. He had confronted the darkness, and in doing so, he had restored the heart of Carter's Pizzeria. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had come home. The morning after the confrontation with Troy and Megan, the pizzeria hummed with a different kind of energy. Gone were the nervous glances and whispered conversations. The staff had witnessed Nick's decisive action, and the respect that had been missing before had now returned, not just for Henry, but for each other. The tables were filled with customers, but it was the atmosphere in the kitchen that felt most significant. There was a quiet pride among the workers as they moved about, each taking extra care in their duties, their eyes focused and purposeful. Nick stood in the corner, his gaze following Henry as he moved behind the counter, checking the ovens and ensuring everything was in place. He had given Henry the chance he deserved, but there was more to do. Henry wasn't just a dishwasher anymore. He was now a manager, and Nick intended to make sure Henry felt the weight of that responsibility, but more importantly, that he felt valued. "Hey, Henry," Nick called across the room. The man turned, a hesitant smile forming on his weathered face. "Yeah, Mr. Carter?" Henry's voice had softened. It wasn't the sharp, tired tone of a man worn down by years of toil. There was life in his voice now, the first signs of a man allowed to breathe again. "Come with me for a minute. I've got a few things to go over with you," Nick said, walking toward the back office, where the employees usually clocked in and out. The kitchen crew paused, their curiosity piqued, but none of them followed. This was between Nick and Henry. As they reached the office, Nick gestured for Henry to sit. "I've been thinking a lot about the future of this place," Nick began, settling into the chair across from Henry. "Not just the pizza, but the people. What we stand for. What I want us to stand for." Henry nodded, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "I want to make some changes around here," Nick said, his voice firm. "Starting today, Carter's Pizzeria is going to be a place that truly values its people. We're not just about serving good food. We're about creating a community. That means making sure you and every other person here has what they need to thrive. I've realized that I've been too focused on the business side of things for far too long. I've neglected what really matters." Henry's eyes softened. "What are you talking about?" Nick leaned forward, a determined glint in his eye. "I'm not just promoting you, Henry. I'm giving you the chance to help reshape this place. You've been here long enough to know the heart of this business. I trust you, and I need your help to make this place a reflection of the values I lost track of." Henry looked at him, his face filled with surprise, but also hope. "You really mean that, Mr. Carter?" Nick smiled, the first truly genuine smile he'd given in a long time. "I do, and I'm counting on you to help me get there." Henry blinked rapidly, clearly fighting back tears. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." "I think I do," Nick replied quietly, his voice catching slightly. "I see you, Henry, and I see everything you've done for this place. You've earned this." The day moved on, and the changes were swift. Nick and Henry sat together in the office, mapping out ideas for better communication, training, and employee support. Henry, once just the quiet dishwasher, now had a voice in the decisions being made. His experience, his perspective, it was invaluable. They talked about everything from employee benefits to customer satisfaction, about how they could implement a new culture where every team member felt heard and respected. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the rest of the team was beginning to see the shift. With Henry's new role came a sense of calm, a feeling that someone who truly cared about them was in charge now. It wasn't just about orders and deadlines anymore. It was about respect, about doing right by each other. Megan and Troy's departure was a quiet one. Nick had ensured that they were escorted out of the premises with dignity, though he couldn't help but feel the sting of what they had tried to do. But it was Henry who stood as a symbol of the kind of leadership that had been lacking. The rest of the staff, even those who had once been indifferent, now had a renewed sense of purpose. Later that afternoon, Nick walked into the dining area where a new group of customers had just arrived. They were regulars, many of whom had heard about the recent changes at the pizzeria. As Nick passed by, he overheard one of the customers talking to the waiter. "This place has always had great food," the man said with a smile. "But there's something different about it today. Feels like home, you know?" Nick stopped for a moment, smiling to himself as he moved past the table. The truth was, he had been so caught up in the business side of things for so long that he had forgotten what made this place special: the people. Now, he was finally starting to see it again. As he moved back to the kitchen, Nick couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was just the beginning. Carter's Pizzeria was going to be different now, and it was going to be better. Henry and everyone else on the team was going to help lead the way. And just as the kitchen staff began working with new energy, Nick's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his assistant, reminding him about the upcoming investor meeting. Nick paused, looking around at the team, the food being prepped, the laughter coming from the dining area. Maybe it was time to stop running after profits and start running after what really mattered. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to make sure this pizzeria stayed a place where people were more than just employees. They were family. As the shift continued, Nick knew he had made the right decision. He wasn't just rebuilding his business, he was rebuilding trust, kindness, and loyalty. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at home. The days that followed Henry's promotion were a whirlwind of change, not just within the pizzeria, but across the entire staff. Henry had stepped into his new role with a quiet authority, taking on responsibilities that had once seemed far beyond his reach. As much as he was still the same man, the one who had spent years scrubbing dishes, helping others, quietly bearing his burdens, there was a new light in his eyes. The weight of years of service, of invisible work, was starting to lift, replaced with a sense of belonging, of purpose. Nick watched as the kitchen crew began to respond to Henry in ways they hadn't before. When orders got backed up, Henry wasn't just standing by, waiting to help. He was directing, guiding, suggesting solutions. His words were carefully chosen, but there was an undeniable shift. He wasn't just an employee anymore. He was a leader. The younger staff members followed his lead without question, and for the first time, the atmosphere in the kitchen felt cohesive. One evening, Nick stood near the counter watching Henry as he worked. The pizzeria was busy. The buzz of conversation mixed with the clink of silverware and the hiss of the pizza oven. It was just another night. But it wasn't. It wasn't just any ordinary shift. Henry's quiet presence, his steady guidance, had begun to foster an environment of respect and collaboration that was now tangible. And it wasn't just the staff who felt it. The customers noticed, too. Nick had already received several comments from regulars about how much warmer the place felt, how they could feel the care in the air. One particular customer, a regular who had been coming to the pizzeria for years, pulled Nick aside as he was walking past. "I just wanted to say something, Mr. Carter," the older man said, his voice low and serious. "I don't know if you've noticed, but there's something different here. Your staff, they seem more united, more genuine. And Henry, He's a good man, been coming here for years, but I've never seen him shine like this. Nick smiled, genuinely moved. It's good to hear that. We're working on making things better around here. The man nodded, eyes softening. You've got a good crew. Don't forget them. Nick's thoughts shifted to the larger picture. This wasn't just about Henry. It was about the culture of the entire restaurant. For too long, he'd been preoccupied with growth, with the bottom line. But now, he was beginning to understand that a business built on respect and integrity would always have a solid foundation. The following week, Nick called a staff meeting. It wasn't mandatory, but it was important. He needed to set the tone for what was to come, to ensure that this change wasn't just a temporary fix, but a shift in the way they ran the pizzeria. As the team gathered, Nick felt a weight on his chest. It was a weight of responsibility, but also of hope. Hope that this new direction would take root, that it would spread throughout the team, and that it would become a defining characteristic of the pizzeria. All right, everyone, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for your hard work. We've made some big changes around here, and I think it's paying off, Nick began, standing at the front of the room. I'm proud of what we're doing together. But it's not just about pizza. It's about creating an environment where we all support each other, where we all look out for each other. It's about making sure that no matter what role you're in, you feel valued. That's what I want this place to be about. The staff exchanged glances, some nodding, others more uncertain. But as Nick spoke, he could feel the weight of his words sinking in. He wasn't just saying these things. He meant them. And for the first time, they believed him. Starting today, we're going to have regular check-ins, not just to go over the work, but to make sure everyone is doing okay. We're going to focus on you as people first and employees second. If you're struggling with something, I want you to feel comfortable talking to me. If you need support, we're going to find ways to help each other, because that's what a real team does. Nick continued, his eyes scanning the room. And Henry, I want to thank you for everything. Your hard work, your dedication. You've shown all of us what it means to be a true part of this family. And because of that, we're going to make sure you're taken care of. Not just as an employee, but as a leader. Henry, who had been standing quietly in the corner, a slight smile on his face, stood a little straighter at the mention of his name. The room was silent for a moment before one of the younger cooks, a man who had started working only a few months ago, stood and clapped. Slowly, others followed suit. The applause was genuine, not just for Henry, but for everything he represented, for what he had given them, and for what they had yet to discover about themselves. Nick felt a surge of emotion in his chest as he watched the room come together. This was the turning point he had hoped for. They weren't just a team anymore. They were a family. And Nick knew deep down that as long as they maintained that spirit of care and support, there was no limit to what they could accomplish together. As the meeting ended and the staff returned to their work, Nick felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about fixing a broken business. This was about creating a legacy, one that would last for years to come. And as long as he had people like Henry by his side, he was confident that they could face anything that came their way. The shift continued, but it was different. There was a lightness in the air, a sense of shared responsibility, and most importantly, a feeling of belonging. The pizzeria had changed, and so had Nick. The weeks following the staff meeting saw the pizzeria go from strength to strength. There was a noticeable change in the air, a new energy that flowed through the kitchen, into the dining area, and back again. The team was more cohesive, more supportive, and most importantly, more united than they had been before. It wasn't just the work that had changed. It was the spirit in which they approached every task. Nick had found himself spending more time in the restaurant, not as the owner, but as a team member. He washed dishes when the rush was heavy, helped assemble pizzas during the busiest hours, and even wiped down tables. It wasn't about delegating tasks anymore. It was about leading by example. One afternoon, just after lunch service, Nick found himself at the counter, sipping coffee and reflecting on the changes. The usual hum of the pizzeria was quieter than usual. He glanced over at Henry, who was standing at the dish station. The old man had a calm expression on his face as he worked, the usual rhythm of his motions slowing only slightly due to the weight of his years. "Henry, how's the back today?" Nick called, his voice light. Henry looked up from his work, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Better, Mr. Carter, better. Gotta take it easy, though." He shrugged, turning back to the dishes. "But I've had worse days." Nick's heart warmed as he watched Henry. The change in the man was evident, not just in his work, but in the way he carried himself. He wasn't the tired, quiet dishwasher who had been burdened with pain and financial worries anymore. He was Henry, the proud new floor manager, the man who had earned every bit of respect he was getting. As the clock ticked toward closing time, Nick noticed something odd. Henry wasn't working alone at the dish station. For the first time since his promotion, another member of the staff, one of the younger cooks, Marco, was standing beside him, helping out. It was a small gesture, but to Nick, it was a powerful one. Henry wasn't just leading from the front anymore. He was teaching others how to care for the team, how to make sure no one fell behind. Marco, a quiet young man who had started as a prep cook just a few months ago, glanced at Nick as he wiped his hands on a towel. "Henry's a good teacher," he said, almost shyly. "He's been showing me how to do things, like really do them, you know? It's not just about getting through the shift, it's about doing it right." Nick nodded, his eyes fixed on Henry, who was still moving with that quiet grace. "I know. He's been here a long time, and he's got a lot to teach." It was true. Henry had been teaching not just the younger staff, but Nick as well. The sense of community Henry had instilled in the team wasn't something that could be taught in business school. It was something that came from living through hardship, from overcoming struggles and choosing to help others instead of giving in to bitterness. That evening, as the restaurant emptied and the lights dimmed, Nick made his way to the back office. He'd been planning something for a while now, and tonight seemed like the right time to make it happen. As Henry clocked out, Nick called him into his office. "Henry, can you come in here for a moment?" His voice was firm but welcoming, as it had been over the past few weeks. He'd made sure Henry knew that, despite the changes in his role, he was still a vital part of the team. Henry stepped in, wiping his hands on his apron, a puzzled expression crossing his face. "Everything okay, Mr. Carter?" Nick smiled, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Everything's more than okay, Henry. I've been thinking about everything that's happened these past few weeks, about you, about this place. And I've come to a decision." Henry sat down, looking uneasy but curious. "What's that?" Nick leaned forward, his voice calm and full of purpose. "I think it's time we take things a step further. We've talked about how much you mean to this team, how much your leadership has impacted the others. But I think it's time we recognize that in a more official way." Henry furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Nick reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the desk toward Henry. "This is for you. It's a new title, a new role. I want you to officially become the floor manager for all 4 of our locations. You've earned it. You've proven that you have what it takes to lead. And I want to give you the resources and the authority to make sure this place runs the way it should, with care, respect, and a strong team behind it." Henry's eyes widened as he stared at the envelope. He didn't open it right away, just sat there, stunned. After a long silence, he looked up at Nick, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what to say." Nick smiled, his heart full. "You don't have to say anything. You've already said everything you need to say through your actions." Henry finally opened the envelope, his hands trembling as he read the papers inside. As he read, his face softened, and Nick could see the weight lifting off his shoulders just a little. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd be in a position like this, not after everything I've been through." Nick shook his head, standing up from his desk. "You deserve it, Henry, and you deserve to have your family taken care of. I've already taken care of the mortgage for the house, so that's one less thing you'll have to worry about. We're a family here, and family looks out for each other." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he stood up, unable to speak for a moment. The man who had spent so many years bearing the weight of the world, carrying others' burdens, was finally being given something in return. "I don't know what to say, but thank you." His voice cracked, and Nick saw something in Henry's eyes, not just gratitude, but relief. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a new beginning. As Henry left the office, Nick felt a sense of peace settle over him. This was what leadership was about. Not just about numbers, about profits, about growth. It was about people. It was about taking care of those who took care of you. And in that moment, Nick knew he had made the right choice. The following day, as the restaurant hummed with the usual lunchtime rush, Nick stood by the door, watching as Henry led his team with confidence, compassion, and care. The pizzeria had changed, and so had Nick. The air in the pizzeria was thick with the warmth of fresh dough, melted cheese, and the familiar hum of busy kitchen chatter. The lunch rush had begun in earnest, but there was something different about the atmosphere today. It wasn't just the increased energy or the fact that business was booming. It was something deeper, more grounded, like the foundation of the restaurant had shifted in a way that would affect everyone who walked through the door. Nick watched as Henry moved seamlessly through the restaurant, directing the staff with ease, his calm demeanor spreading like a quiet wave across the room. As the new floor manager, Henry had settled into his role with grace, offering guidance where it was needed and stepping back when the team was already in sync. He had become a symbol of patience and wisdom, a reminder of everything that mattered in the business they ran. Henry had earned this position, not just with his dedication, but with his heart. And it was clear to everyone around him that he wasn't just managing a team. He was leading it, inspiring it. Nick's mind often returned to the earlier conversation in the office. He had offered Henry the job, the title, and the house, and Henry had accepted. But there was still so much more that needed to be done. Nick had given Henry a chance, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He needed to make sure that his entire team felt the same sense of security and pride that Henry had found. He needed to look beyond the walls of the restaurant and address the concerns that had started to grow within him over the past few weeks. The diner, despite the community it built, had been functioning on a shaky foundation. The employees were more than just workers. They were family. And when that family struggled, the entire operation struggled. Nick had seen the cracks before, but now, with the team in place and Henry showing them what real leadership looked like, he had an opportunity to right the ship. He stepped into the kitchen, where a young cook, Marco, was slicing vegetables for the evening special. Marco looked up, offering a quick smile, but there was a tension in his shoulders that Nick couldn't ignore. As the younger man went back to his task, Nick took a deep breath and walked over. "Everything okay, Marco?" he asked, his voice low but full of concern. Marco hesitated, his knife pausing mid-slice. He looked up at Nick, his brow furrowing. "Yeah, it's been tough. I've been working a lot of overtime, and it's starting to take a toll." Nick nodded. "I know how that feels. That's exactly why I'm here." Marco looked at him, confused, and Nick smiled warmly. "I want you to know that from here on out, things are going to be different. No one here is going to burn out, and no one is going to feel like they're being taken advantage of. Starting today, I'm implementing some new policies for the entire staff." Marco straightened, surprised. "What kind of policies?" "First, we're going to give everyone more consistent hours. No more random shifts that leave you scrambling. You'll know exactly when you're working and when you're off. Second, we'll be offering health benefits for all employees who work more than 30 hours a week. We've got to take care of each other, and that means you don't have to choose between your health and your paycheck." Nick's gaze softened. "And lastly, if anyone needs help with anything, we're going to find a way to make it happen. Whether it's financial assistance, family emergencies, or any other support you need. This isn't just a job. It's a family." Marco's eyes widened, and his lips parted in surprise. He didn't know how to respond at first. "Are you serious? You're really going to do that?" "I am," Nick confirmed. "I've realized that I've been too focused on the business side of things, too focused on growth. I forgot that the people who make this place run are the heart of it, and without them, we don't have anything." Marco gave him a hesitant smile. That's amazing. Thank you, Mr. Carter." Nick clapped him gently on the shoulder. "No need to thank me. We're all in this together." As Marco returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose, Nick stepped back into the dining area where he saw Henry walking toward him. The older man's face was alight with the steady confidence of someone who had finally been seen, not just for his work, but for the person he was. "Mr. Carter," Henry greeted him, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had experienced the deepest kind of relief. "How's everything looking?" Nick smiled, his heart lifting as he watched the team come together around Henry. "It's looking good, Henry. Better than good. It's looking like family." Later that afternoon, as the pizzeria quieted down and the staff began to clean up, Nick sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had seen his business grow from a small idea into a thriving operation, but it had taken a single act of kindness, a single moment of honesty and transparency, to make him realize that there was something even more important than the numbers on a balance sheet: the people who worked for him. They were the backbone of the restaurant, and it was time for him to give back. As the sun set outside the pizzeria's windows, casting a warm glow across the dining room, Nick made a promise to himself and to his staff that he would lead with empathy, with heart, and with integrity. The pizzeria wasn't just a business anymore. It was a community, a place where every person, no matter their role, mattered. The following weeks felt like a rebirth for Carter's Pizzeria. The changes Nick had put into motion were not just about policy. They were about creating a culture of care and support, where the people who made the business possible felt valued, heard, and seen. The staff quickly took notice of the new atmosphere, and the transformation was palpable. Marco, who had been working long hours with little time for himself, now had a balanced schedule. The weight of worry about bills and health no longer weighed him down. He was thriving in a way that Nick hadn't expected, bringing fresh energy to the kitchen, experimenting with new recipes, and helping the other cooks with techniques he had once struggled to master. His joy was contagious, and it wasn't just the staff who noticed. Customers did too. They remarked on the new energy, the smiling faces behind the counter, the food that seemed to taste even better than before. Even Henry, who had once been overlooked and taken for granted, had become a symbol of the pizzeria's renewed purpose. His promotion to floor manager had brought a new sense of pride to his step. He was no longer the quiet dishwasher in the back. Now he was the heart of the operation. His wisdom, patience, and kindness were woven into every interaction he had with the team. Whether he was overseeing the staff or offering a comforting word to a nervous customer, Henry made the restaurant feel like home. Nick spent more time in the restaurant, not as the owner who popped in and out of meetings, but as the leader who worked alongside his team. He joined the staff in preparing pizzas during the lunch rush, helped clean up during closing, and sat down for conversations with employees to hear about their lives outside of work. He learned about their families, their struggles, and their dreams. In turn, he shared more of himself, his challenges, his experiences, and the lessons he had learned from his own mistakes. The pizzeria, once a place of hustle and hard work for the sake of growth, had transformed into a place of community, empathy, and mutual support. And as Nick walked through the dining room that evening, watching the team work together seamlessly, he realized that the business wasn't just about the pizza anymore. It was about the people who came together to create it, and the customers who trusted them with their meals. It was in the quiet moments, after the last customer had left and the staff gathered for a late-night meeting, that the true impact of the changes began to sink in. The new policies had given the employees a sense of security, but it was the relationships they had built with one another that truly mattered. They were no longer just coworkers. They were a family. Nick sat at the head of the table, surrounded by his team. He smiled as he looked around at their faces, all of them tired but content. "You guys did incredible tonight," he said, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "But there's still more to do. We've built something special here, and I don't want to stop now. We're going to keep improving, together." Henry nodded, his voice gravelly but strong. "It's not just the pizzas that make this place great, Mr. Carter. It's the people. And I've never been prouder to be part of this team." Nick met his eyes, a flicker of gratitude passing between them. "That's exactly what I've learned, Henry. It's the people." As the weeks turned into months, the pizzeria continued to thrive. The changes Nick had made in the workplace began to spread beyond the walls of the restaurant. The kindness, empathy, and care that had been cultivated within the pizzeria were evident in every aspect of the business. The community embraced the pizzeria not just for its food, but for the way it made people feel, valued, respected, and supported. Nick had come to realize that success wasn't just about profits and expansion. True success was about creating a place where people could not only grow professionally, but could also feel safe, understood, and supported personally. It wasn't about the bottom line, it was about the human connection, the relationships that were built, and the lives that were touched along the way. And so, as Nick stood in the pizzeria one late evening, looking around at his team and the customers who had become like family, he knew that he had found the secret to real success. It wasn't in the numbers or the accolades. It was in the love and respect that filled the room, in the hands that prepared the food, in the smiles that greeted each customer, and in the hearts that worked together to create something far greater than pizza. With the lessons he had learned, Nick made a vow. He would never again let his focus drift solely onto the business side of things. The people were always going to be the heart of Carter's Pizzeria, and as long as he remembered that, the rest would follow. Months had passed since the day Nick Carter had made his decision to act, to listen, to truly understand the lives of those who worked for him. Carter's Pizzeria had grown beyond a successful business. It had transformed into something deeply meaningful, a place where both employees and customers felt a sense of belonging. But more importantly, it was a symbol of Nick's personal evolution, the journey he had taken to rediscover the very core of his business. The restaurant was now a beacon in the community. It was known not just for its pizza, but for its heart. People spoke about the kindness of the staff, the genuine care that was baked into every meal, the way the team worked together, lifting each other up in ways that went far beyond typical workplace dynamics. Nick had learned that leading with compassion wasn't just a way to improve morale. It was the secret ingredient that made everything else fall into place. Marco, who had once feared he might never be able to support his family while chasing his dream, was now thriving. His passion for the craft had returned, and he brought a new level of creativity to his pizza making that had customers raving. He was also more present with his children, no longer working around the clock. With the financial stability and time he needed, Marco's life outside of work flourished, and it showed in the care he put into each pizza he created. Henry, now a full-fledged manager of the front of the house, had stepped into his new role with grace and humility. The respect he had earned from his team was palpable. No longer was he the overlooked dishwasher working long hours in silence. He was the heart of Carter's Pizzeria, the embodiment of everything Nick had hoped the restaurant could be. His calm, measured presence settled any dispute and soothed every anxious customer. He had become a mentor to many of the younger employees, teaching them not just how to work, but how to treat others with dignity. And then there was the surprise that no one expected. The pizzeria's once quiet neighborhood had begun to flourish. With Nick's commitment to creating an inclusive, supportive environment, Carter's Pizzeria became a gathering place for community events, charity fundraisers, and support groups. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was a home for those in need, a place where bonds were formed over shared meals and stories. Nick had started something far beyond the pizzeria. He had created a legacy of care, one that extended past the kitchen and into the hearts of the community. Nick stood in the middle of the pizzeria one evening, the hum of conversation filling the air, the clink of silverware and the sizzle of pizza in the oven a comforting backdrop. He watched as his team moved through the dining room, exchanging smiles and friendly jokes with customers. There was a warmth in the atmosphere that Nick could feel deep in his bones. For a moment, he allowed himself to step back and take it all in. The restaurant, the team, the community that had embraced it all. This wasn't just a business he had built. This was a living, breathing entity, a reflection of his own transformation as a leader, as a person. He smiled to himself, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had found the balance between success and humanity, the balance between profits and purpose. And he knew, as he watched his staff work side by side with respect and care, that this was just the beginning. The evening wound down, and Nick found himself sitting at a table with Henry, Marco, and a few of the other team members. It had become their tradition to gather at the end of each week and share what they'd learned, what they were grateful for, and what the future held. As the team discussed upcoming ideas for new dishes and events, Nick felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. It wasn't the food, or the expansion plans, or the awards that mattered. It was the people. It was the community they had created, one that would last long after the pizzas had been served. "I couldn't have done it without you all," Nick said, looking around the table. "Each of you has played a part in this, and it's something I'll never forget." Marco, ever the humble one, chuckled. "We all did it together, Nick. You gave us the space to be who we are, and that's what made the difference." Nick nodded. "And I'll keep making that space, I promise." And with that promise, Nick Carter knew that the story of Carter's Pizzeria was far from over. It had become more than just a place to eat. It had become a symbol of what was possible when people led with empathy, kindness, and unwavering dedication to one another. As they all stood to clear the table, Nick couldn't help but think back to the day he'd heard Marco's confession, when everything had changed. That moment had been the turning point, the catalyst for all that had followed. And now, with his team by his side, he was ready to keep building, both the pizzeria and the community that had become his true legacy. As the days passed, things at Carter's Pizzeria continued to improve. The restaurant, once a place of just good food, had transformed into a hub of warmth and care, where employees felt valued and supported, and customers were drawn not just by the taste of the food, but by the kindness they felt the moment they walked through the door. Nick watched his team grow, not just in skill, but in trust. He knew the success of his business wasn't just about the pizza anymore. It was about the people. Marco had flourished, finally able to spend time with his children and pursue his dreams without the crushing weight of financial fear. Henry had become a mentor, his wisdom and kindness evident in everything he did. And the restaurant itself, once just a business, had become a symbol of community and compassion. Nick couldn't help but smile as he stood in the doorway watching his team work. They weren't just employees, they were a family. And that was something he had almost lost sight of. It wasn't always easy, the challenges were real. But seeing the change in his team, in his business, and in himself, he knew it had all been worth it. "Thank you," Nick said to the team, his voice filled with emotion. "You've reminded me what this place was always meant to be, and I'm so proud of what we've built together." With that, the team erupted into cheers, clapping and laughing. The energy was electric, the sense of camaraderie palpable. The customers, too, were buzzing with excitement, sharing in the warmth of the moment. It felt like a new chapter had begun, not just for the pizzeria, but for the community that had rallied around it. And as Nick stood there, surrounded by the people who had made this transformation possible, he knew the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thank you for watching and being a part of this incredible journey. Stories like these remind us all of the power of kindness and the importance of seeing beyond the surface. If you believe in the impact of leadership with heart and want to see more stories that inspire real change, make sure to subscribe. Let's keep sharing these stories of compassion, growth, and community together. Until next time, take care of each other and keep spreading kindness wherever you go.